All right, guys, I just want to do a short little video here on how reason and logic actually works in our existence and how it actually applies to our reality at all times and how it's important and how you can actually apply it and use it on the climate alarm question to totally destroy it at the very basis. So it's pretty clear to me that we're not actually taught in school what reason and logic is and how to critically think, right? That's what critical thinking is all about, is reason and logic and how to use those things. You're not actually taught that in school. You're not taught really anything about that. What you're taught in school is how to remember things and how to repeat them. That's a different thing than reason and logic and critical thinking. Remembering something, being good at remembering something and repeating it is not critical thinking. I think they have some naive hope that it'll make you smart in the sense of critical thinking, but it's really not. It's making you a good repeater, not a good critical thinker. Now, critical thinking is obviously what is required for understanding. You can repeat things without understanding at all. Now, that's the crucial point there, isn't it? In school, what's the purpose of an exam, of tests? It's testing how well you can repeat something, how well you remember something. Well, you can remember something and repeat it without understanding what you're doing whatsoever, right? You can train animals to do things like that. It's basically treating you like an animal rather than like a critical thinker that understands what they're doing using reason and logic. All right, so first let's go over how reason and logic work in our existence. Basically, it works like this. You start with a premise. This is how an argument is formed, right? This is how, like, you go from postulate to theory to fact, for example, or it's basically just how a thought process develops, okay? So you start with a premise. That's your starting point. It's your assumptions. You can call it a paradigm. You can call it the fundamentals, right? That's all the same sort of thing. So you're starting with some general thought that you have, some general thought pattern, some fundamental components, some axioms or whatever. I should have put axioms there in that box maybe. You're going to start there, and then you're going to see where it leads. So there's your starting point. Then you go to something dynamic. You go through a dynamic process of extrapolations, consequences, actions, effects. You sort everything out. You start with your starting points, and then you analyze them, and you see what happens. How does this all work together? What's the dynamic sort of internal flux of your starting points? How do they work together? How do they sort themselves out? What are the consequences? What are the extrapolations? What are the actions? What are the effects? Then from there, you finally will end eventually at final results, conclusions, and endpoints. Okay? That's how a basic chain of logic, of thinking, of ideas and concepts works. Okay? Pretty simple. Now, I have a real important question for you that you never saw in school. You were never taught to think properly, critically. You were never actually taught to think. You were taught to repeat, not to think. So here, I'm going to show you how thinking works, how reason and logic works in our existence right now. This is going to be fascinating for some of you, but it needs to be said. What happens if your starting point and your premises and your assumptions and your fundamentals and your paradigm is false? What happens if all those things are false, but let's say you didn't know it? Well, let's say they were all false and you didn't know. What happens when you start with something false? Where does it lead? Where does it lead to start with something false? Okay, this is real critical thinking you're learning here, and reason and logic in reality. This is how our existence works. This is the laws of physics. This is the laws of logic. This is what exists in the structure of our space-time for how logic and critical thinking and thinking works. What happens when you start with something false? You extrapolate false things from it. You extrapolate false consequences, false actions, false effects. And where do you end? You end with false results, false conclusions, false endpoints. Okay? That's how logic and critical thinking works. It's consistent. To be logic, it has to be consistent. Logic is consistent. By the very rules in mathematics and definitions of logic and reason, if you start with something wrong, you end with something wrong. Okay? If you start with something false, you end with something false. Okay? We're not taught how to think anymore. We don't read the classic and ancient Greeks. We're not taught that in school anymore. Those people back then figured out how to think. And, you know, all the philosophers who continued in their sort of vein in the intellectual philosophical tradition, they worked out how to think. But you're not taught that in school. You're taught how to repeat. So that's how thinking works. This is important. You start with something false, you end with something false. Yeah, like, I guess I got to state these things. It's not clear that people understand this, especially in climate alarm. The climate alarmists really hate this. You'll see why in a second. All right, so what's the alternative? If you start, now I'll just go back actually a second. The point of ending in false results and false conclusions, if you end there, it's still helpful because it tells you that you started somewhere incorrect. If you end with false results, false conclusions, false endpoints based on, say, a test against reality, an empirical test or some other test or some other, you know, purely logical consequence, logical conclusion, that doesn't make any sense. It tells you that you may have started somewhere wrong, or your extrapolations and effects and your thinking through it went wrong, right? It's still helpful. All right, so what if you start with something true? If you start with true premises and assumptions, then you will make true extrapolations if you're doing it properly. And yes, sometimes you can go wrong there, and you have to go back and fix something. Fix whatever your thinking, your thought process was, but basically this is how it should work. You start with something true, then you work out true things, and you end with true conclusions. Okay? So, that's important. Now, let's look at where climate science starts. Okay? Climate science, climate alarm science, starts with its version of a greenhouse effect. This is not the same greenhouse effect that you actually find in a real greenhouse, although they try to tell you it is, but it's not. I'll make a separate video about that again. But this is their greenhouse effect. And just to prove it, I have a bunch of samples here. So here's Harvard University. Here's their greenhouse effect that they're drawing, that they're working out. Here's the math and the physics, and wow, that sure looks complicated. Better remember that. Better remember how to repeat that on a test, right? Does that mean you understand it? This is going to be funny in a second. Here's Pennsylvania State University, same diagram, slightly different way, but it's the same thing. Someone else drew it. University of Chicago, here's a guy giving a lecture at the University of Chicago on their greenhouse effect. It's the same thing, you can see. Same terms, same things happening there. Here's University of Washington's Department of Atmospheric Sciences. Same thing happening there. It looks just the same. Columbia University, same thing going on. All right, and then here's some text that explain the same thing. But anyway, there's several samples. So now, if you're a good rememberer, well, what do you do with that? Well, the good rememberer repeats that. That's what good rememberers do. That's what you've been taught to do in school. You better be a good rememberer for the exam. And you better remember all these terms. You better remember them. You better have a really good memory. You better remember to draw this. And draw it just like this, right? Well, what if you understood it instead? And see, the layperson will look at this, and the scientist definitely who produced it. And but as far as the layperson goes, they look at this and they're probably scared off of the mathematics that are in there and the physics and what's going on. Like, it looks complicated. That's for smart people, right? Yeah, it's for smart people who are good rememberers, right? But what happens if you apply critical thinking to this? These lines, what this diagram here is supposed to be representing is the sunlight coming in on the Earth. That's what this diagram is supposed to represent, sunlight hitting the Earth. Okay? So let's not be afraid of the terms and the equations and the things happening in there. And I want you to look at the Earth. So this line, it's a surface. What line is that? What geometric shape do you call that? Like if you extended that into 2 dimensions, it's a 1-dimensional line right there. If you extended it into 2 dimensions, then what is it? It's a flat line or a flat plane. So they're representing the Earth. This is sunlight coming into the entire Earth. And the entire Earth is a flat line or a flat plane, a flat surface. Right? It's flat Earth. They do it over and over and over again. Now from this flat Earth, then they go on, and all of the rest of this mathematics is some consequences, some extrapolations. They extrapolate a bunch of things based on this flat Earth, with sunshine coming onto a flat Earth. They start there, then they make a bunch of extrapolations, and then they end with some conclusions. And the conclusions, of course, are all about the alarmism. Okay? Now, let's go back here. Is their premise false or true? Is the premise in their physics, in their mathematics, false, or is it true? What's the premise? What's the underlying geometric mathematical premise here? The underlying, well, the obvious, it's right there in front of you. It's in the numbers right here. That's what they're doing with the numbers, is to make these numbers satisfy this line, this flat plane. That's what they're doing. They're making these numbers of sunlight input, sunshine falling onto the Earth. They're making sunshine falling onto the Earth conform to this geometry, which is flat surface, which is flat Earth. So, what do you think of those premises? Are those premises true or are they false? Is that how sunlight falls on the Earth? Is that what the Earth is? Does sunlight fall over the entire surface of the Earth at once, as if the Earth is a flat plane? Is that true or is that false? Climate alarmists and scientists think it's true. Yeah, they think it's true. Are these premises true or false? They are false. These are false premises. And this is the sole foundation of climate alarm, of climate change alarm science. It is the fundamental foundation from which all of their predictions about warming come from and is made from. They're starting there, they're extrapolating a bunch of stuff from there, and then they're resulting in the conclusion. Now, what is empirically or factually wrong with that? Well, obviously we went over the geometry already, right? Obviously it's a flat Earth. That doesn't make any sense. As far as some of the numbers go, like in terms of the extrapolations, consequences, effects, things like that, what has to happen, what you have to do with the incoming solar radiation, incoming solar heat, in order to make it on this flat surface, spread over this flat surface Earth, you have to do an operation on it, dividing it by 4, and what that does is reduces the solar heat to minus 18 degrees Celsius. So what they are forced to do by starting with these false premises of a flat Earth, what you are mathematically forced to do then as a consequence on paper is to make your sunshine, the strength of your sunshine heating, the strength of your solar heat on paper, mathematically, you have to make it equal to, the number works out to minus 18 degrees Celsius. So in climate alarm science, they treat the Earth as flat, and because of that, they treat solar input as minus 18 degrees Celsius. Now, does that make sense to you? False extrapolation or true extrapolation from your premises, from their premises? Yes, you have the answer. If you're a thinking person, it is a false extrapolation. It makes no sense to say that sunshine falls on the Earth at only minus 18 degrees Celsius heating potential, because that would mean that sunshine should be freezing cold. How do you ever get a summer? How do you ever get sunshine that can melt ice or snow? How do you ever get evaporation or anything else that can happen that is caused by sunlight? And we know that's because you know that sunlight is actually really warm and really hot. If you go to the equator, the sunshine is doing all sorts of insane amounts of evaporation. And if there was an unlucky ice cube out on the ground on the equator, it's going to melt quite quickly because of solar heat, real solar heat. But climate science treats solar heat as minus 18 degrees Celsius. Well, what a conundrum, what a confusion. So what do? They continue on. They continue on and invent a mechanism to create more heat. And how do they do that? That's their greenhouse effect. That's all these arrows. They say that the atmosphere then comes back, sends heat back to the surface to heat the surface some more. So it's not the sun heating the surface and melting the ice cube, because the sunshine is only minus 18 degrees Celsius. What they're saying is that it's the atmosphere that's making you feel so hot. Well, where does the atmosphere get its heat from? To send you that energy, to send you that heat energy? There's no answer to that. They just say that it does, and it's false. They just pretend that it does, and it works out some way. Basically, what they do is they add temperatures together. They're pretending that you can add 2 ice cubes to a cup of coffee and make a warmer temperature. It's basically they're saying you can. They're basically stating the question as a statement that you can add a certain number of ice cubes together to raise temperature. That's basically what they're doing with the atmosphere. They're saying, well, if we add enough cold atmosphere, the cold atmosphere will turn warm, as if adding ice cubes together makes the ice cubes turn warm. That's what they're doing. Okay, they invented a mechanism to create more heat because they treated solar heat as minus 18 degrees Celsius. Okay, they treated solar heat as minus 18 degrees Celsius. Finding themselves in the position of why is there anything warmer than minus 18 degrees Celsius, they then invented a mechanism to create extra heat. Now, how does this work out? We know now. You start with false premises, you make false extrapolations, and you end in false conclusions. That's what they did. Flat Earth was false. Forcing the solar heat to be spread over this entire flat Earth makes it on paper only equal to minus 18 degrees Celsius worth of heat from sunlight. That's false. Then they have to invent a false mechanism to create more heat so that we can explain why we feel anything warmer and see anything occurring at higher temperatures than minus 18 degrees Celsius. Okay, do you understand the logic of that works? Because I'm really finding that a lot of people don't, especially the climate alarmists. They don't seem to understand the logical progression here, how reason and logic works out, how rational critical thinking works out. Now, just for a comparison, I made this little diagram of how the sun actually does fall on the Earth. So sunlight falls over only over a hemisphere, half of the Earth at any time. And the real solar power at the top of the atmosphere is quite warm. It's actually 120 degrees Celsius worth of heating. Sunlight is hot as heck. It's really quite hot, even when you live north, like where I live, 51 degrees north latitude in the summertime. It still makes asphalt too hot to walk on. Sunlight is hot as heck. That's sunlight doing it directly. It's not the atmosphere causing more heating. The atmosphere has no heat descend. The sun has heat descend because it's a fusion reactor, because it's releasing and liberating energy, raw, pure energy. It's coming from nuclear processes. It's a nuclear reactor releasing raw energy and heat. That's where heat comes from. It's the only place heat is coming from for the Earth. Basically the only place. There's no geothermal heat basically on the Earth, or very little you can forget about. The only place that heat is coming from is from the sun. Heat doesn't come from the atmosphere. The atmosphere isn't liberating anything. There's no chemical or nuclear processes happening in the atmosphere to liberate that is liberating raw energy as heat. So this mechanism they created, as we know, is totally false on so many different ways you can look at it. It's false. So here's real sunlight coming in. It's hot as heck. It's 120 degrees Celsius, and it falls on the Earth, and it's falling on the Earth with enough heat and enough energy to cause the weather all on its own. That sunlight heat causes cumulonimbus clouds that will rise something like 30,000 feet into the atmosphere, into the air altitude. Think of how strong solar heat has to be to raise a giant mass of water, a small lake's worth of water, to 30,000 feet. That's solar heat doing that. In their scheme, with minus 18 degrees Celsius, solar heat can't do that. So they invent this other scheme, that the atmosphere is causing itself to do it. It's a circular argument, what they've created. And of course, you expect that. You expect illogic to go with illogic. So if you start with false premises and you try to keep going with them and you try to force them to work, yeah, you're going to create things like paradoxes and circular arguments and all sorts of stuff like that. So they have this circular argument that sunshine is too cold to evaporate water and create cumulonimbus clouds and to create higher temperatures, and so therefore the atmosphere must heat itself by some mechanism they've invented. And they say, oh yeah, look, see these arrows and see the numbers and see the math? I can remember this and repeat it, therefore it must be true, because they were never taught critical, rational thinking. Okay, isn't that funny? I mean, it's just funny how that works out. People have been so stupefied by our education system of remembering. Make sure you remember this. I can remember these arrows and I can remember how to draw them and I can remember where these terms go and the equations go. And because I remember that, I'll get a good mark on my exam and therefore it must be right. It's so stupid, as if people think that that's how thinking works. As if people think, God, it's so dumb. Anyway, real solar power, real solar energy, has actual solar energy as it's actually coming in, has all the power required to generate the weather and generate the climate. I just put some pictures in here. It's evaporating, then it's raining, then it's condensing, and then it's cooling, and then it happens all over again every day, every year. Every day this is happening, and the sun can do it all. The sun is doing it all because solar heat is quite hot. It's 120 degrees Celsius at the top of the atmosphere, and it's still almost 100 degrees Celsius when it gets down onto the ground. It's warm. On the equator, obviously it gets cooler as you go north, but still the general idea is, the fact is that the sun is creating the climate. Here, with the climate alarm flat Earth starting point assumption, they have to make the climate create its own climate. They have this circular argument of, well, sunshine is minus 18 degrees Celsius and it's freezing cold. So, I mean, it basically almost does nothing. It's not melting water. It's not evaporating. It's doing anything. And so, let's see. Yeah, let's invent a mechanism where the climate makes the climate, where the atmosphere heats the atmosphere with no new source of energy, no anything like that. Let's just invent that that's what happens. And again, they call this scheme the greenhouse effect, because a greenhouse is something that we're familiar with, that you go inside and it's warmer than the outside. It's a trick. They're just lying to you. It's just a convenient lie. This isn't how a greenhouse works at all. This scheme that they've invented here with the atmosphere heating itself, that's not how a greenhouse how a real greenhouse works. A real greenhouse works because it's heated by the hot sun and it keeps the warm air inside, rather than when you're outside, the air just convects away and gets replaced by cooler air falling from above. Okay, so they're totally lying. They totally hijacked this term, this idea of a greenhouse, and what actually happens in a real greenhouse. And they tried to say that that's what their mechanism is, but it's totally false. It's a lie. Okay, so I hope you learned something today. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, watch this over and over again if you need. Okay, let's go back to the logic. Premise, extrapolations, results. You start with false premises, you will make false extrapolations, and you will end in false results. So, for example, they start with the false premise of drawing the Earth as a flat line. The extrapolations are that they have to then mathematically on paper force sunlight to be minus 18 degrees Celsius. in order to fit that premise. That's just how it works out. That's how it works out. That's what their numbers mean. So they extrapolate that sunshine is minus 18 degrees Celsius, and then they form a conclusion that the atmosphere must heat itself, and they call that the greenhouse effect, and they call that, and they say that it'll be augmented or made stronger by your emission of carbon dioxide, and therefore you should be taxed for it. That's the scheme. That's how the scheme works. Okay, you get that scheme? Again, they start with the false premise of drawing the Earth as a flat line. They make an extrapolation then in the mathematics to force, in order to fit sunshine, to fit that model, that premise, they have to force sunshine on paper to be only minus 18 degrees Celsius. Then they make a conclusion that the atmosphere must heat itself with carbon dioxide. And you should therefore be taxed for it, and we should basically feel bad for our existence and basically stop breathing and all this ridiculous stuff that they do. Okay? In comparison, we can start, as I demonstrated, the comparison would be you start with true premises, which are real sunlight, which is actually really warm, falling on a round Earth. The extrapolations are that sunlight has the power to create the climate, to create cumulonimbus clouds that go to 30,000 feet in the air to cause all the climate that we know of. And the conclusion then is that, well, these are the facts we already know. We're not concluding anything new. Well, in comparison, we can compare it and contrast it to climate alarm and say, sorry guys, your model, your scheme, your racket, for whatever the heck it is you're trying to do with your stupidity of the carbon alarm and the taxation, whatever this is, whatever stupidity it is, yeah, it's just stupid. And you're just stupid. Stop being stupid. We don't like stupid people. All right. Enjoy. Hope you like that. Goodbye.